Okay, so the last form or the last approach to ethical theory I want to talk about is virtue theory. And as with the other theories, virtue theory, even more so than consequentialism and utilitarianism or rules based theories and Kantianism, virtue theory is very much a family of theories. And so we are going to focus, as we have with the others, on the most influential one of this type of theory. We're going to focus on Aristotle's approach to virtue theory. But one thing I'm going to emphasize is that there are really, really different approaches to this, but we have to narrow it down, have to pick one, and we'll go with Aristotle. Now, but before we do that, I want to take a step back and just say a little bit about what motivates the whole approach that virtue theory takes and about what virtue theory is. And this is the reason I gave you the article on Fred Rogers. When I do in-person classes, a lot of times I'll actually have them watch a documentary on Rogers. You know, can't really do that online. I think you could get the documentary through the TCC library, but it's a pain in the neck. And this article I think is really good. And just the question I want to ask is, we had this with the quiz we started with, but do you think Rogers is an person of exceptional moral goodness? As he's described in this article, or if you watch the clip I put up, you can also watch the movie, look at other sources, and I think by just about any account, Fred Rogers is a person who is exceptionally morally good. I read about this guy, I think about this guy, and he's one of those people who makes me feel a little guilty for not being a better person, right? And if Rogers is good, if you think he's exceptionally good, if you think he's better than average, how would you describe what makes him good? In what ways is Rogers a good person? What is the best way to describe this goodness? And my point with that question is just that I don't think that utilitarianism or Kantianism gives us much in the way of a language to describe what makes Rogers exceptionally morally good. We could pick other people, but Rogers I think is just a good example. If you sit down and say, well, okay, what makes this guy morally good? What is so good about him? I don't think you're going to reach for language of duty. I don't think you're going to reach for the Kantian account at all. Is Fred Rogers, is what Tom Juno is struck by him in this article, is that here is a guy who always does his duty? No, right? I mean, duty doesn't even come in it at all. Pretty pointedly not, right? Rogers seems to enjoy what he's doing. This feeling of constraint, of being kind of forced by duty. If you read accounts of his life, it's not something that seems to register in a big way there, right? One of the things people say makes him exceptional, this pops up in the documentary I have my in-person classes watches, even children or even people that other people would find very trying to be around, Rogers was patient with, Rogers was kind to. Juno will say at the time I wrote this article, I was a kind of a nasty person in a lot of ways. Rogers was very patient and kind to me, even though he had no reason to expect I was going to write a very complimentary article, given the kind of stuff I'd written in the past, And he talks about this, like, creating a personal change in him, right? It's not like, oh, I have to do my duty, I have to be around this journalist I promised to be around, or I'm contractually obligated to be around these children, so I will do it. That doesn't look like him at all. Duty doesn't seem to register here, and somebody who did things that are similar to what Rogers does, but out of a sense of duty, seems like he would be a lesser person, not somebody as exceptional. Utilitarianism also doesn't seem like, the right way to describe it, right? Did he create a lot of happiness? Yeah, it seems like he did. But, was he expressly thinking have to maximize overall utility? I'm exceptionally good with children, so I'll do a children's show. I mean, no, right? He never seems to think in terms of utility, and if you were describing what was exceptional about him, I don't think the first things you would say is like, oh, look at all the utility he created being kind and patient with America's children, all the happiness he created. I mean, we would say, here is a guy who always does what he thinks is morally right. That seems in line with Kantianism. Here is a person whose life brought a lot of happiness to people around him. That is in line with utilitarianism. But neither seems to offer us a very good description of what we might find admirable or exceptional about a person like this. Now, and another set of closely related questions, do you think he's leading a good life? And by this, I don't mean, good is a blurry, vague term. You have to pin it down. By this, I mean, is he leading the kind of life that you think is good for him? The kind of life that you might want for yourself or your children, right? If your children led a life like this, would you think it is good for them? Have they done well, right? And I think most of us would, right? He seems pretty exceptional, He's getting biographies written about him. He seems to, he wasn't immune to human disappointment or pain or any of that stuff, but he seems to have led a very, for lack of a better word, happy life, right? He seems to have been a person who accomplished great things and was pretty happy or very happy with, the way his life had went. And we would look at his life, most of us, and say, well, this went well. And we would also probably say that the kind of person he is, the kind of good person he is connected to the kind of good life that he led. His moral goodness is one of the things that enabled, him to have a life that we would find good, that we would find admirable, if not even enviable. Well, what kinds of language would we reach for in describing what makes him good? Well, we would probably, reach for terms that make reference to his character. He's kind. He's self-disciplined. He's loving. He's understanding. He's empathetic. When we're describing what makes him have a good and enviable life, Kantianism, utilitarianism both seem out of place, right? If you're thinking of other people's happiness, maximizing utility, one of the points of utilitarianism is that you often have to make huge sacrifices in your own level of well-being, how well your life is going, to create happiness elsewhere. Kantianism might not be as bad, but the whole picture Kant has is that morality is this thing that puts some limits, puts some restraints on you pursuing your own self-interest. Morality and your desire to have a good life seem to be fundamentally at odds. So they don't seem to offer us any language in describing how the goodness of someone like Rogers hooks up with him leading a life that is in some very real sense good, or we might say flourishing. And again, his goodness and the fact he's leading a flourishing life seem connected to the kind of person he is. He can lead the kind of life he does because he's kind, because he's self-disciplined, right? This radical empathy and being able to see where others are coming from, this patience, all of these are traits that come back to character. We are talking not about following the principle of duty, not about creating overall happiness, but the kind of person he is, his character. And virtue ethics is an approach that takes that as its starting point. It is an approach to ethical theory that starts with a focus on character. The fundamental question virtue ethics asks is what kind of people we should be. What kind of person do you think is a good person? What makes them good? It'll talk in terms of these character traits. It says, well, when we see that, we'll want to develop the same character traits or similar ones and become the same kind of person. So a focus on character rather than individual actions is one thing that characterizes virtue theory. Virtue theory will, it won't entirely do away with talking about individual actions, but when it talks about an individual action, it will focus on what it says about us as a person. Kant will say we shouldn't lie to a friend to get money because that violates the categorical imperative that uses that person as a mere means. Virtue theory, on the other hand, will say, well, if you did that, think about what it would say about you as a person. You are dishonest. You are disloyal to your friends. You are selfish. On the other hand, imagine what utilitarianism would say about why we should help somebody in need. Well, because our money might create more happiness elsewhere. We want to do good cost-benefit analysis, spend our resources where they create the most happiness. That's not what virtue theory would say about helping somebody else out. It would say, well, look, if you help another person, well, what does it say about you as a person? If you do it in cases where you really should help, you're generous, you're kind, you are not selfish. So they offer us a different way to think about morality generally, and they will always come back to these character traits. Now, there are a lot of different forms of virtue theory. A lot of modern philosophers have tried to develop some form or other. The famous economist, and also philosopher Adam Smith has a form of virtue theory. His friend David Hume also tries to develop a form of it. If you look at ancient Chinese philosophy, I don't think it is entirely, I think it's actually a pretty good way to read Confucius as a form of virtue theory. There are a lot of philosophers who've taken this approach. We will focus only on Aristotle. So for two reasons. One is Aristotle's form of virtue theory has been the most influential in the West by far. When we talk about virtue, Aristotle has set a lot of the agenda. So it's really influential, that's one reason to talk about it. It's also, I think a really good piece of philosophy. There's some things Aristotle says that we might not agree with, but he's always worth kind of debating with, right? Stood the test of time. Some other philosophers have too, which brings me to another reason we'll read Aristotle, which is just that I am a lot more familiar with Aristotle than I am with other forms of virtue theory. I know Aristotle pretty well. I think I can do a good job of guiding you guys through it. But I do want you guys to ask two questions as we go through Aristotle. One is just, is virtue theory generally a good approach to morality? Is a focus on character and what actions say about us as people, what kind of people we want to be, is that a good way to think about morality? And as with a lot of philosophical theories, just to tip my cards to y'all, I'm going to say in some ways it is, it very much is, in some ways it's going to come up short. That's going to be my view on it. Again, you don't have to take my view, but just, I think that's where I'm going to come down. But I want you to keep this in mind and answer it for yourself too. Second question is, what do we think of Aristotle's own particular account of what a good person, a person of good character looks like? And what do we think about the individual virtues? And one thing I'm going to say to you guys, just, a heads up, Aristotle's own account of virtue is influenced by his culture, which, for lack of a better word, I mean, I could use a fancier word. It is what we would recognize as a very macho culture. You know, Aristotle would look at somebody like Fred Rogers and probably not find him virtuous. He is into more sort of military virtues at some point, you know. In a lot of ways, this is tied to what an Athenian of several hundred years BC would think a good citizen should be like. So I think we're going to definitely take issues with some parts of Aristotle's account. Some things he says are going to be very much tied to his own culture. And that is a general issue with virtue theory. How tied is it going to be to a specific culture? How universal can it be? But I also think, we'll have to see how much you guys agree, but I also think even when Aristotle says stuff that kind of sounds like a record scratch to us, that we might not agree with, he's not crazy. He usually has very good reasons for what he says. So even where Aristotle very much says something that we find shocking, I do think he's going to be worth taking seriously. But at the end of the day, you know, we are probably going to differ with him on some individual virtues and what the virtuous person looks like. But even if we do, I think he's a person worth arguing with. Okay, so that's my introduction. In the next lecture, we will start into Aristotle's actual ethics.